friends, welcome back to Quiza.
Today we are with you with a Who's That Pokemon challenge. Before starting, please subscribe to your channel. Are you ready, friends? Let's go. Who's that Pokemon? Bulbasaur. Who's that Pokemon? Charmander. Who's that Pokemon? Pikachu. Who's that Pokemon? Squirtle. Who's that Pokemon? Eevee. Who's that Pokemon? Rattata. Who's that Pokemon? Charizard. Who's that Pokemon? Magikarp. Who's that Pokemon? Mew. Who's that Pokemon? Blastoise. Who's that Pokemon? Pidgey. Who's that Pokemon? Snorlax. Who's that Pokemon? Gengar. Who's that Pokemon? Mewtwo. Who's that Pokemon? Dragonite. Who's that Pokemon? Jigglypuff. Who's that Pokemon? Meow. Who's that Pokemon? Venusaur. Who's that Pokemon? Lapras. Who's that Pokemon? Alakazam. Who's that Pokemon? Clefairy. Who's that Pokemon? Psyduck. Who's that Pokemon? Vaporeon. Who's that Pokemon? Jolteon. Who's that Pokemon? Flareon. Who's that Pokemon? Machamp. Who's that Pokemon? Geodude. Who's that Pokemon? Gyarados. Who's that Pokemon? Raichu. Who's that Pokemon? Arcanine. Who's that Pokemon? Diglett. Who's that Pokemon? Ninetales. Who's that Pokemon? Charmeleon. Who's that Pokemon? Ivysaur. Who's that Pokemon? Wartortle. Who's that Pokemon? Nidoking. Who's that Pokemon? Nidoqueen. Who's that Pokemon? Onyx. Who's that Pokemon? Arbok. Who's that Pokemon? Zapdos. Who's that Pokemon? Moltres. Who's that Pokemon? Articuno. Who's that Pokemon? Zubat. Who's that Pokemon? Ditto. Who's that Pokemon? Chansey. Who's that Pokemon? Growlithe. Who's that Pokemon? Ekans. Who's that Pokemon? Dratini. Who's that Pokemon? Mr. Mime. Who's that Pokemon? Butterfree.
Thanks for watching.